There comes a time in life when you realize silence has changed. When you are young, silence feels like freedom. Later, it begins to feel like distance. And eventually, if you live long enough, silence becomes something else entirely. It becomes invisibility. Rachel Monroe understood that truth in a way few people ever did. She sat alone in the communications trailer at Camp Alder, a forward operating base tucked deep into unforgiving terrain. Outside, engines hummed and boots scraped against gravel as younger men moved with urgency and purpose. Inside, the light was dim, steady, and quiet, much like Rachel herself. At 34, she was not old by any standard, but experience does not measure time the way calendars do. Some years carry more weight than others, and Rachel had lived through years that bent time permanently. Once her name had meant something here. Not loudly, not publicly, but decisively. There had been briefings where plans were altered because of her presence. There had been moments when commanders had waited, not because of rank, but because of trust. Rachel Monroe had been a long-range precision operator, the kind whose work rarely appeared in reports and never in headlines. She had been valued because she did not hesitate when hesitation meant loss. Now she was assigned to communications support. Her name appeared on rosters in small print, no call signs, no operational symbols, just a function. Useful, reliable, replaceable. She didn't argue the reassignment when it happened 3 years earlier. She had asked for it, in fact. At the time, stepping away felt like survival. There are decisions that follow you home at night, and Rachel had grown tired of explaining them to herself in the dark. Still, knowing why you step aside does not make being overlooked any easier. She adjusted her headset and studied the glowing map in front of her. Her eyes followed elevation lines automatically, noting choke points and shadows without conscious effort. Old habits did not disappear, they simply learned to wait. Behind her, voices passed by, unintended, careless. She used to be out there, right? So I've heard. Hard to believe. Rachel did not turn around. At a certain point in life, you stop correcting people who have already made up their minds. Experience teaches you that dignity often lives in restraint. On the small table beside her rested an old rifle scope, wrapped carefully in cloth. She cleaned it slowly, methodically, as if it were something fragile. She no longer owned a rifle. The scope had no purpose now beyond memory. Every adjustment brought back another place, another night, another moment when she had made a decision that could not be undone. The radio crackled. "Base, this is Ranger 2-1. Rachel's hand paused mid-motion. "We've got contact, multiple hostiles." Her spine straightened as she leaned toward the console. The background noise told her more than the words. Too sharp, too constant. This was not an isolated encounter. She pulled up the live feed, her fingers moving with quiet confidence. The terrain appeared familiar in an unsettling way. Low ground, limited exits, enemy movement from multiple angles. She exhaled slowly. Someone else in the command center spoke. "Weather's grounding air support." Another voice followed. "Nearest ground unit is at least 40 minutes out." Rachel did not need to hear the rest. She had already done the calculation. Then came the phrase that changed everything. "Ammunition is running low." Rachel closed her eyes for a moment, not in fear, but in recognition. At her age, panic had been replaced by memory, and memory could be far heavier. The radio came alive again, quieter this time. "If anyone copies, we won't hold much longer." Rachel opened her eyes. She stared at the screen, then at the scope resting beside her. 3 years ago, she had chosen to step away. Tonight, the choice was returning to her, and silence was no longer an option. The command center filled with motion, but not direction. Maps shifted on screens. Voices overlapped. Someone asked for confirmation that everyone already understood. Rachel Monroe remained seated, listening more than speaking, watching the quiet unraveling of structure that came when plans began to fail. Ranger 2-1's transmissions grew shorter. That, more than anything else, concerned her. Men who had trained for chaos did not waste words when time slipped away. They conserved breath. They conserved thought. And eventually, they conserved hope. Rachel marked enemy movement on the digital terrain, drawing lines no one asked her to draw. Old instincts worked beneath the surface, uninvited but precise. The enemy was not reckless. They were shaping the fight, pressing from high ground, closing exits, forcing Ranger 2-1 inward. A trap. The operations officer stood behind her now. He did not address her directly. "Tell them to hold until ground support arrives." Rachel nodded slightly, acknowledging the order, though she knew it was hollow. Holding required ammunition. Ammunition was nearly gone. The radio erupted with gunfire again, closer, sustained. Base, Ranger 2-1 said. His voice was calm, but something beneath it had shifted. We've lost the north flank. Rachel felt the weight settle fully into her chest. She had heard that tone before, years ago, another place, different terrain, same arithmetic. Men versus minutes. She removed her headset and stood. The decision was not sudden. It had been forming since the first transmission, shaped by memory and sharpened by experience. At this stage in life, decisions did not come with drama. They arrived quietly, fully formed. Rachel walked toward the weapons locker at the far end of the trailer. No one stopped her. People tend not to question those who move without hesitation. The locker recognized her credentials immediately. The green light blinked once before the door unlocked. Inside waited the rifle she had once trusted more than words. It rested in its cradle as if time had never touched it, cleaned, calibrated, patient. She lifted it carefully. The weight settled into her hands like an old responsibility she had tried, unsuccessfully, to forget. Rachel performed the checks automatically. Chamber, bolt, optics, everything responded as it always had. Tools, unlike people, remembered what they were built to do. For a moment she hesitated, not from doubt, but from understanding. 3 years earlier, she had walked away because she was tired of being the final variable in someone else's fate. She had told herself that stepping back was an act of wisdom, not fear. And perhaps it had been. But wisdom, she had learned, did not always mean absence. Sometimes it meant return. The radio crackled again. If anyone copies... The pause that followed carried more weight than the words. We're running out of options. Rachel keyed the mic. Her voice, when it came, was steady, almost gentle. I copy. Silence followed. I need you to hold your position, she continued. Reduce movement. Stay low. I'll handle the rest. Base, the team leader replied cautiously. Confirm. Rachel did not answer. She already knew confirmation would lead to questions. Questions would lead to delays, and delays would cost lives. She slung the rifle over her shoulder and gathered what she needed. Ammunition, rangefinder, night optics, a small medical kit. Her movements were efficient, unhurried. Someone finally noticed. Monroe, the operations officer said sharply. What are you doing? Rachel paused and met his eyes. Doing what I should have done sooner. Before he could respond, she turned and stepped outside. The night air was thick and damp, heavy with the smell of earth and vegetation. The jungle waited beyond the perimeter, dark and indifferent. Rachel crossed the boundary without ceremony. As she disappeared into the trees, the base behind her continued its controlled chaos, unaware that one of its quietest occupants had chosen to step back into responsibility. Some choices cannot be delegated. Some burdens do not belong to the young. And some experience exists for exactly one moment, the moment when everything else fails. The jungle did not welcome Rachel Monroe. It never had. The moment she crossed beyond the last perimeter light, the world narrowed into shadows and sound. Moist air clung to her skin. The ground shifted underfoot, soft in some places, treacherous in others. Every step demanded attention, every breath carried weight. This was not the world of training ranges and briefing rooms. This was the place where mistakes stayed forever. Rachel moved carefully, not quickly. Speed without awareness had ended more than one career, and more than one life. She placed her boots with intention, allowing the jungle to reveal its rhythms before imposing her own. Years away from combat had dulled nothing essential. If anything, time had refined her patience. Her muscles complained almost immediately. Not sharply, not dramatically. Just enough to remind her that the body remembers years even when the mind resists them. The climb ahead would test more than endurance. It would test whether discipline could still overcome hesitation. She checked her watch. Minutes mattered now. In her earpiece, Ranger 2-1's transmissions continued, clipped and economical. Positions adjusted, ammunition counts fell. The voices were steady, but thinner. Rachel adjusted her route toward higher ground, angling for a ridge she remembered from the terrain overlay. Elevation was everything. From above, pressure could be relieved. From below, survival narrowed. As she climbed, memory followed. Another ridge, another night. Snow instead of humidity. A younger version of herself lying prone behind stone that offered little protection and no comfort. She remembered the weight of the decision then, the moment when waiting became more dangerous than acting. She had made the right choice that night. She had lived with it ever since. Rachel reached the base of the rock face and paused, steadying her breath. The ascent was steep, unforgiving. 20 meters of near-vertical stone, slick with moisture and worn smooth by time. She secured her rifle and began the climb. Her hands searched for purchase, finding edges where none seemed visible. Years ago, she would have climbed without thinking. Now, she measured each movement, listening to her body, respecting its limits without surrendering to them. Halfway up, her arms trembled. She stopped, pressed close to the rock, and waited. Patience, she reminded herself, was not weakness, it was strategy. When she reached the top, the world opened. Below her, the valley lay exposed, dark shapes moving against darker ground. Muzzle flashes blinked like distant signals. Ranger 2-1's position was clear now, compressed into a shrinking perimeter. Rachel lowered herself into position and allowed stillness to return. This was the moment younger operators imagined when they thought of combat, the dramatic arrival, the surge of adrenaline. But Rachel knew better. Real moments like this were quiet. She adjusted her scope, factoring distance, wind, elevation. Numbers settled into place naturally. Her breathing slowed. Her heartbeat followed. Time stretched. The first target revealed himself not through movement, but through confidence, a figure directing others from elevated ground, exposed by certainty. Rachel waited. She had learned long ago that impatience disguised itself as courage. When the moment came, she did not rush it. The rifle fired. The recoil was familiar, grounding. The figure dropped. Confusion rippled through the enemy line almost immediately. Movement slowed. Coordination faltered. Rachel chambered the next round. This was not about dominance. It was about relief, buying time, space, possibility. She shifted targets, working deliberately. A machine gun position fell silent. Another leader collapsed mid-command. Below, Ranger 2-1 began to move, slowly, cautiously, but with renewed purpose. The radio crackled. "Unknown support," the team leader said. "Identify." Rachel keyed her mic briefly. "Maintain position," she replied. "Overwatch active." She did not offer a name. Names complicated things. As she scanned for the next threat, a flicker at the edge of her vision caught her attention. Movement that did not belong to panic or retreat. Flankers. 2 of them. They moved with discipline, low, coordinated, careful, not amateurs. Rachel assessed the distance and made a decision that had nothing to do with ego. She secured her rifle. Some lessons could not be taught. They could only be learned. And some skills, once earned, never truly left. The jungle closed in again. But this time, Rachel Monroe was exactly where she needed to be. Rachel Monroe felt them before she saw them. It was not fear. Not instinct alone. It was experience, quiet, practiced, and unhurried, that alerted her to the shift in the jungle's rhythm. The night sounds had changed, not stopped, changed. Someone was moving with intention. She eased back from the scope and scanned the terrain without lifting her head. 2 shapes advanced through the undergrowth below her position, their movement controlled, deliberate. These were not men retreating in confusion. These were professionals responding to disruption. They were looking for her. Rachel did not rush. At her age, rushing belonged to younger people who still believed speed solved everything. She understood better. Time, when used correctly, was an ally. She checked her watch. Ranger 2-1 was still alive, still moving, still had a chance. That was enough. Relocating to an alternate firing position would have been the textbook response. But textbooks assumed time and options. Rachel had neither. Instead, she chose the harder path. She secured her rifle against the rock and moved into the shadows beside the narrow approach route. The terrain funneled movement here. Anyone advancing would have to pass within arm's reach. She slowed her breathing until it barely registered. Memory surfaced again, not of firefights or shots taken, but of training rooms long ago where instructors spoke quietly about what happened when plans collapsed. When the rules fail, they had said, character takes over. The first man appeared moments later, rising cautiously over the rocks. His rifle was raised, eyes searching. He never saw Rachel. She stepped forward once. The encounter ended without sound. Rachel did not linger. She repositioned immediately, becoming part of the darkness again. Her heart rate remained steady, her movements efficient. There was no satisfaction in this, only necessity. The second man arrived 90 seconds later. He was more careful. He paused, scanning, sensing that something was wrong. His training told him not to advance. His mission told him he had to. Rachel waited until uncertainty won. The outcome was brief and final. When it was over, the jungle resumed its indifferent hum. Rachel returned to her rifle. Below, the valley had changed. Enemy movement had slowed dramatically. Without leadership, without pressure, their coordination dissolved. Some withdrew. Others hesitated long enough to be neutralized by Ranger 2-1's remaining strength. Rachel resumed Overwatch, providing measured support, nothing excessive, nothing wasteful. Each shot served a purpose. Each pause preserved control. The radio crackled again. "Overwatch," Ranger 2-1 said, breath audible now but steadier. "You changed everything." Rachel allowed herself a single breath of relief. "Recommend immediate movement to extraction," she replied. "Window is open." "Copy," came the response. "Outstanding work. Can you identify for after action?" Rachel smiled faintly in the darkness. "Negative," she said. "Some things don't need names." She disconnected the mic. From her position, she watched the team withdraw methodically, covering one another with discipline born of survival. They would make it now. The arithmetic had shifted. Rachel stayed until the valley fell quiet. Only then did she begin her descent. The climb down was slower, more punishing. Fatigue had finally caught up with her, settling into her bones like cold. Her hands ached, her legs trembled. But the work was done. By the time Ranger 2-1 reached extraction, Rachel was already moving away, back into the trees, back into anonymity. The jungle did not mark her passing. It never did. Morning arrived without ceremony. The jungle did not change its posture after the night's violence. Birds resumed their calls. Mist lifted slowly from the ground. If someone had wandered through the valley unaware, they would have seen nothing that suggested how close several lives had come to ending there. Rachel Monroe returned to Camp Alder just before dawn. She timed her approach carefully, entering during the shift change when attention was divided and routines mattered more than faces. No one stopped her. No one asked where she had been. That, she thought, was fitting. Inside the communications trailer, she removed her pack and cleaned her equipment with the same care she had shown the night before. Every item returned to its place, every trace erased, not out of secrecy but out of habit. By the time the base fully woke, the story had already begun to circulate. Ranger 2-1 had survived an impossible situation. They had been surrounded, outnumbered, and nearly out of ammunition. And yet somehow the pressure had lifted at precisely the right moment. There were questions, of course. Who had provided Overwatch? What asset had not appeared on the board? Why had the enemy collapsed so suddenly? Rachel listened from her chair as others speculated. She did not contribute. Late in the afternoon, Commander Ellis entered the trailer. He was a man Rachel respected, not because he spoke loudly or often, but because he understood the difference between authority and leadership. "Monroe," he said quietly, "a word." She followed him outside, where the air was warm and still. Ellis did not waste time. "My team is alive today because someone acted when no options remained," he said. "That kind of intervention doesn't happen by accident." Rachel met his gaze without expression. "Experience tends to reveal itself," he continued, "even when it doesn't introduce itself." She said nothing. Ellis studied her for a long moment, then nodded once. "I'm not opening an investigation," he said. "I'm closing a conversation." Rachel felt something loosen in her chest, not relief exactly, but recognition. "Thank you," he added, "for understanding when rules serve the mission and when they don't." When he walked away, Rachel remained where she was, watching the horizon. Later that evening, a message appeared on her terminal. Status update. Operational capability review. Priority. She stared at the screen longer than she expected to. 3 years ago, she had believed stepping away was the end of something. Tonight, she understood it had only been a pause. She deleted the message without responding. Not because she was refusing it, but because she needed time to decide what returning would mean now. As the sun dipped low, Rachel found herself at the edge of the firing range. She hadn't planned it. Her feet had simply carried her there. She removed the rifle from its case and began to clean it again. Slowly, deliberately. The motions were familiar, grounding, metal and cloth, solvent and patience. A younger sergeant approached hesitantly and stopped a few feet away. "Ma'am," he said, I wanted to apologize." Rachel looked up. "I made assumptions," he continued, "about you, about what mattered." She considered him for a moment. "At some point," she said calmly, "everyone does." He nodded, embarrassed. "I won't forget last night." Rachel returned her attention to the rifle. "That's not necessary," she said. "Just remember to listen before you decide who's finished." The sergeant left quietly. Rachel watched the sun disappear behind the trees. There were no medals waiting, no citations, no photographs. But there was something else, something that mattered more at this stage of life. Respect without noise, gratitude without demand, recognition without exposure. And for Rachel Monroe, that was enough. Change, when it finally came, did not announce itself. There was no meeting, no formal acknowledgement, no explanation offered to the people who would have asked the wrong questions anyway. One morning, Rachel Monroe's name simply reappeared where it had once been missing. On the deployment roster, on the training schedule, on quiet lists that mattered. It was as if the system had corrected itself. No one spoke about the night in the jungle. Not directly, not officially. But people noticed patterns. They noticed how senior officers paused when Rachel entered a room. They noticed how assignments shifted subtly around her presence. And they noticed the way Ranger 2-1's commander met her eyes and nodded once, as if confirming something that required no words. Rachel accepted the change without comment. At her age, she had learned that the loudest victories often carried the shallowest meaning. What mattered was not how things looked, but how they worked. The younger operators treated her differently now, not with awe, not with fear, but with something quieter and more durable. Respect. It showed in small ways. A question asked carefully, a pause before speaking, an invitation to weigh in that carried genuine interest rather than obligation. Rachel did not offer stories from the jungle. She did not correct assumptions or feed curiosity. When asked about her past, she redirected the conversation toward preparation, discipline, and judgment. The work, she told them, is rarely about talent. It's about knowing when not to act and when waiting becomes irresponsible. Some listened, some didn't. That was fine. Not every lesson needed to be learned at once. One evening, just before sunset, Rachel stood alone at the firing range. The air was still, heavy with the smell of earth and metal. She disassembled her rifle piece by piece, laying the components on the table in familiar order. The rifle was not remarkable by itself. It was glass and steel, engineered with care, but powerless without intention. Rachel had learned long ago that tools were never the story. People were. She thought about the years she had spent trying to disappear, about the quiet belief that stepping back would ease the weight of past decisions, about how wrong she had been. You could leave the field, you could change your role, but you could not outrun responsibility. The night in the jungle had not returned her to who she once was. It had clarified who she had become. Older, slower perhaps, but steadier. There was a strength in that steadiness, a strength that did not rush toward danger, but did not retreat from it either. Rachel reassembled the rifle and secured it in its case. As she did, she noticed a group of younger operators nearby, watching without speaking. She met their eyes and gave a small nod. They nodded back. No ceremony, no performance, just understanding. As the sun slipped below the horizon, Rachel felt a sense of calm she had not known in years. Not because the world was safer, she knew better than that, but because she had made peace with her place in it. Some people serve in daylight. They wear rank, collect recognition, and move on when the time comes. Others serve differently. They work in the margins. They act when systems falter. They accept that their impact will be felt long after their names are forgotten. Rachel Monroe had learned which kind she was, and she was content with it. When she left the range and walked back toward the base, the lights behind her flickered on one by one. Another shift, another night, another set of lives depending on choices yet to be made. Rachel did not hurry. She had time now. And when the moment came, as it always did, she would be ready.